A black man sat quietly on the edge of the operating table, eyes lowered, not meeting anyone's gaze. His hand trembled as he signed the consent form, a signature jagged, torn midway through his name, like the final breath of self-worth leaving his chest. "Just lie still," the nurse said. "After the surgery, you'll receive your payment." No one in the room asked why he was there. No one asked about the unpaid electric bill taped to his fridge or the lawsuit he filed 3 months ago over wages that never came. He lay back on the cold steel table, fingers brushing the left side of his waist, the part of him that would soon be gone. He wasn't selling a kidney to buy a car or to escape to someplace better. He was selling it to buy milk, to keep the heat on, to survive winter, to buy his children a few more weeks of safety. This wasn't a crime, it was a consequence. And behind it was a story the system never wanted you to hear. If someone handed you a single-dollar bill, but told you you'd have to trade your health, your dignity, and a piece of your own body to earn it, would you take it? For most people, that question lives in philosophy books and late-night ethics debates. But for Darnell Hayes, it wasn't a question. It was a decision, sharp, cold, and precise, like the scalpel that would cut into his flesh the following week. Before he became the man who sold a kidney, Darnell was just a factory worker, steady, quiet, overlooked, at an auto parts plant on the edge of New Haven, Connecticut. He never made waves, never made excuses. He showed up 10 minutes early every day, clocked out on time, and had one small habit. Each time he finished a section of bolts, he'd write the date in pencil on the corner of his workstation, the same stub of a pencil he kept in his uniform pocket, just to remind himself, today I still mattered. And then one autumn morning, when the wind turned crisp and the oak trees outside the factory began to drop their yellow leaves, the manager called the workers together. Due to restructuring, they were told, we're letting people go. Darnell didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply stared at the worker board on the wall, where his name still hung, wedged between two men who had left the company the year before. Vince Maynard, the company's owner, a well-pressed white man in pastel shirts who called everyone family, clapped Darnell on the shoulder. "I know you need the money. You'll get your last 2 months' pay. Just give it some time." Then he disappeared. No more emails, no phone calls returned, no office left open, just a promise, invisible and cold, like the dust gathering on Darnell's empty workbench. He knocked on the police station's door. The officer on duty spoke without lifting his head. "Labor disputes aren't our jurisdiction. File a civil case." So Darnell went to the courthouse. The clerk, a woman in glasses with a face carved from stone, looked at his paperwork and said, "It'll be reviewed in 6 to 8 weeks, depending on priority." He asked, barely above a whisper, "And what if I don't make it to week 6? She didn't answer, just slid the paperwork back to him and said, "You can hire an attorney if you want it processed faster, but there's a fee." That night, in a kitchen with 3 dented cans of beans and an expired loaf of bread, his wife Angela didn't cry. She sat cross-legged on the floor, counting food stamps. Quiet. Darnell looked at her. Their eyes met, not in anger, not in blame, but in something heavier, resignation. And then, barely audible, as though her voice might break if she said it too loud, she whispered, "I can go hungry, Darnell, but the kids, they can't." No one should ever be placed in that kind of position. No one should have to carve into themselves to feed the people they love. But when the police ignored his pleas, when the court stalled his paperwork, when the man who owed him vanished behind corporate lawyers, Darnell's body, once strong from years of honest labor, became the last thing he could offer. The Connecticut night rain wasn't heavy, but it was bitter. The kind of cold that slides through your coat, into your bloodstream, and settles in the hollows of your chest, like something's been taken from you, and you don't even know what it was yet. Darnell sat on a stone bench outside the last coffee shop on the block. He wasn't one for coffee. Night shift stomachs are trained to run on water and aspirin. But tonight, he just needed a place to be. Somewhere that wasn't home. Somewhere he could sit and not feel like a failure just for walking in empty-handed. Footsteps approached. Firm, deliberate, not rushed. Darnell looked up. A man stood beside the bench. Heavy coat, hands in his pockets, eyes calm, like he already knew exactly who he was here to meet. "You Darnell Hayes?" Darnell gave a small nod. The man pulled out the chair across from him, placed a steaming paper cup on the table, and slid it across. "I heard you used to work for Maynard." Just one sentence, but Darnell understood immediately. This man knew too much. The conversation that followed barely lasted 10 minutes. No paperwork, no names, just words carefully chosen, each one carrying the weight of something darker behind it. "It's a transplant exchange program, legal on paper, safer than you'd expect. Every case is screened, every recipient is matched. No one's being taken advantage of. You weren't picked out of pity, Darnell. You were picked because your body's clean, strong, and you need the money." Darnell didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He went home silent, and for 3 nights he didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because he couldn't stop trying to redefine what being good even meant in a world that gave you no choices. The clinic sat just outside New Jersey, 3 hours by car from New Haven. Polished storefront, laser-cut signage, licenses framed neatly behind the front desk. No raised voices, no probing questions. Just 3. Do you have a relative who needs a transplant? Are you giving consent voluntarily? Do you understand this decision is irreversible? Darnell signed. They said the payment would come after surgery, and they kept their word. The next day, his bank showed $10,000 after taxes, after administrative costs. For the first time in 4 months, Darnell came home with a full bag of groceries. He told Angela that someone had paid him back. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped her arms around him, softly, like she was afraid hugging too tight might break whatever part of him was still holding on. A week later, the broker returned. This time, he smiled more. "We've got new openings. If you know someone who's stuck, send them our way. You'll get $1,000 for each successful referral." Darnell wanted to say no, but then he thought about the school fees coming due, the cracked sink that kept leaking, the coat his daughter was growing out of. Again, and he thought, if I've already traded part of myself once, then maybe, just maybe, it can buy something better for someone else. He didn't post flyers, didn't knock on doors. He just had quiet conversations with a few old friends, men who'd been out of work even longer than he had, men who were won missed rent checks from living in their cars. Some said yes, quietly. One came back with enough to buy a used car and whispered, "You saved me, D." But there was one name Darnell never brought up, Marquis. They'd known each other since middle school, played ball behind the high school gym. When the factory shut down, Marquis had been let go first, picked up odd jobs, moved crates, took shifts no one wanted. He used to joke, "I was broke before it was cool. Don't worry about me, man." Darnell never mentioned the transplant program to him, not out of fear, but because Marquis was still too young. Then one night the phone rang. Marquis. His voice was rough, uncertain, like he'd walked 10 miles in the cold just to find the courage. "D, that thing you told Tavon about, the fast cash? I need it." Darnell paused, then asked on quietly, "You sure?" The answer drifted through the line, soft as New Haven wind. "More sure than I was when I signed up for the Army. At least this time I know they ain't paying me to die." And Darnell, like every man who's ever fallen far enough to forget what light feels like, realized for the first time he was no longer just a victim. He was a door, and someone was about to follow him through it, into a darkness he still didn't know how to leave. Spring came early to New Haven that year, but the cold lingered. Not the kind that comes from weather, but the kind that seeps into your bones from things unspoken, from truths trying to rise through layers of silence that look, from the outside, like peace. Darnell Hayes no longer felt pain in his left side. The scar had healed faster than he expected. He didn't have trouble sleeping anymore. But that wasn't because of peace either. It was exhaustion, bone deep, soul heavy. He didn't think much about Marquis anymore. Or maybe it was more honest to say, he didn't let himself think about him. There were no texts, no missed calls, no complaints. Darnell convinced himself, if something had happened, I'd know. And then, he knew. That afternoon, he was carrying a box of bargain bin noodles home from the discount grocery when his phone rang. On the other end, Marquis's mother. Her voice came in broken bursts, as if she were crying and running at the same time. Marquis is in the hospital. He collapsed. The doctor said something about his surgery, his organs. Oh God, who let him donate anything? The ground tilted under Darnell's feet. The noodle boxes slipped from his arms, clattering across the sidewalk. He didn't bend to pick them up. He didn't move at all. Just stood there, phone pressed to his ear, heart yanked clean from his chest. With no warning, no anesthesia. At St. Raphael's Hospital, Marquis lay unconscious in the emergency room. The heart monitor beeped slow and steady. His skin was pale, paper thin, almost translucent. The intake form read, post-transplant patient, suspected infection from unregulated donor procedure. When a nurse asked, does anyone know where he had the surgery? There was no answer. And that silence, that institutional unknowing, triggered protocol. The police were called. 3 days later, a warrant was issued. Officers showed up at Darnell's housing complex. No notice, no knock. They treated it like they'd uncovered the kingpin of an international crime syndicate. The news spread fast. Local headlines screamed, man arrested in black market organ scheme. Suspect accused of preying on the poor. Mastermind remains at large. No one mentioned that Darnell had filed a wage theft complaint months earlier. No one noted that his case had been rerouted for reassessment. No one asked how a broke factory worker could possibly orchestrate a complex transplant ring. In the interrogation room, there were no questions like why, only accusations like how many. A young officer, barely 30, buzz cut sharp, gun holstered like a badge of pride, leaned across the table, narrowed his eyes and hissed, guys like you always got the same script. Blame the system, play the victim. But the truth? You're smart. You're educated. You knew how to work the angles. Darnell didn't respond. He had no more energy to defend himself. No illusions left that speaking the truth would make anyone listen. Police called it a successful first strike. They said they had disrupted a trafficking ring. But on the arrest record, there was only one name, Darnell Hayes. No doctors, no middlemen, no clinics, just one father, sitting in a holding cell, waiting for a trial. And across the news feeds, his name was dragged through mud. Man who lured the desperate. He sent his own friend to the edge of death. A criminal in disguise. Angela Hayes couldn't stay silent any longer. The media showed up at their door. Neighbors stopped saying hello. Even the kids started coming home asking, where's Dad? Why does everyone online say he's bad? That night, after putting the kids to sleep, Angela sat alone on the kitchen floor. She didn't have a law degree. She didn't know legal terms, but she had a piece of scrap paper and a pen that barely worked. She began to write, Dear Mrs. Jasmine Crockett, you don't know me. I'm the wife of the man accused of convincing others to sell their organs. But before he ever did that, he knocked on 11 doors, police stations, courtrooms, legal aid. Not a single one opened. I'm not writing to ask you to help us win. I'm writing to ask you, please just hear the whole story. I believe if someone truly listens, they'll see where the real truth lies. People call him a criminal. I call him the best husband a poor woman could ever ask for. If you can, please don't let our story be stuffed into some dusty drawer again. Angela folded the paper gently, slipped it into a yellowed envelope. She didn't have a formal office address, just a street name she remembered hearing once on a podcast Jasmine Crockett had spoken on months ago. She pressed the stamp on, then stood outside the mailbox a long time, holding the envelope, fingers trembling, as if letting go might change the world. Finally, she opened her hand, and the letter fell. Soundless. The visitation room at the county detention center was lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb, humming faintly, like even it was tired of hearing the stories that were told inside these walls. Gray cinder block walls, a wooden table, plastic chairs, A pane of scratched glass separated the incarcerated from their visitors, unless, of course, a lawyer requested otherwise. That morning, Darnell had been called up without warning. The guard said, "Lawyer wants to see you." Private room. Darnell didn't have a lawyer. He hadn't requested one. But he got up anyway, not because he expected anything, but because he had nothing left to lose. The door opened, and the woman who stepped inside didn't carry a briefcase. She wasn't wearing a tailored blazer like on the courtroom shows. Just a navy blue button-down, black khakis, a thin pair of glasses. Her posture was upright, her hair pulled into a low knot. Not stern, not soft, just still. She set her bag on the empty chair. Didn't introduce herself, didn't reach out a hand. She simply sat and looked at him, not with judgment, not with pity, but with a kind of unwavering presence that made it impossible to lie. Then she spoke, low, steady, measured. "I don't need you to explain. I need you to show me. Who pushed you here?" No one had ever asked Darnell that before. Not why he did it, not if he knew it was wrong, but who pushed him here? A question that flipped the script, shifting him from guilty man to broken man. He didn't answer at first. His hands twisted in his lap. The pulse at his wrist beat too fast. He stared at the woman. 10 seconds passed, long enough to feel like a lifetime. Then he cried, not loudly, not with sobs, just tears, silent, warm, trailing down his cheeks, wetting the corners of his mouth. Darnell had once been a laborer, a husband, a father, a man who'd hauled 10-pound steel parts with bare hands, a man who'd stood straight through pouring rain. But now it took only one question to undo him. I didn't want anyone to know, not because I was afraid, but because I was ashamed. I tried. I really did. But every door I knocked on, they shut it in my face. I used to think if you didn't steal, didn't fight, didn't run, justice would find you, but justice don't have ears. Jasmine Crockett didn't take notes. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if granting permission for him to keep going. And so he did, for the first time, from the beginning. About Vince Maynard, the businessman who once clapped him on the back, called him family, and then vanished with 6 months' pay in a broken promise. About the courthouse, where his complaint sat in a dusty cabinet no one opened. About the police station, where officers glanced at his papers like unpaid bills left too long on the desk. About the clinic, pristine, polished, perfectly legal. And about Marquis, the friend he tried to protect, the one he never dared name aloud at night, the one who still followed him anyway. I messed up, I know that, but I don't think I'm a bad man. I just didn't know what else I could do. And for the first time as he said it, he didn't feel like he was making excuses. Jasmine stayed still. Her eyes never left his. And when Darnell finally fell silent, she leaned in just slightly, her voice softer now. "Then what if I told you there's a way to tell this story exactly the way it happened? Would you let me?" Darnell didn't ask how, didn't ask why she'd help. He just nodded, his eyes red, his hand resting on the table, shaking slightly but no longer hiding. And that was the moment, the precise, silent moment, when listeners everywhere, no matter what side they'd taken, began to forgive Darnell Hayes. Not because he was innocent, but because now they understood. He hadn't chosen wrong. He'd been pushed into it. And no one, not once, had asked, "Who pushed you there?" No one ever expects blood on an operating room floor to trace back to a spreadsheet. But Jasmine Crockett, with nearly 2 decades of legal and human rights work under her belt, knew all too well. The ugliest crimes often begin as innocuous-looking line items. A community outreach grant, an operating expense reimbursement, a footnote labeled internally audited. 3 days after speaking with Darnell Hayes, she stood outside a modest building on the edge of Newark, New Jersey, one registered as the Center for Regenerative and Community Health. The sign gleamed. The glass doors sparkled in the morning light. almost too bright, like someone trying too hard to be seen as clean. To Crockett, that sheen didn't inspire trust. It smelled of performance, the kind you only rehearse when you know someone's watching. She posed as a curious donor. The receptionist, young, light-skinned, sporting a medical badge and a too-polished smile, greeted her with a practiced tone. "We don't do anything illegal, ma'am. Every procedure is voluntary. We have licensed physicians and complete documentation." And just like that, Crockett knew, because only the guilty start defending themselves before anyone asks. She noted the license number on the wall behind the counter. Dr. Calvin W. Mercer. A quick records check confirmed it. Once a licensed surgeon in Texas, Mercer had his license revoked after a fatal incident, one that never made headlines, but was leaked inside hospital circles back in 2017. Since then, he'd vanished. Now he re-emerged, this time not as a doctor, but as a non-practicing consultant. A loophole, clever, but not new. Crockett didn't stop at the nameplate. She filed a formal request to the local bank, under the name of a civil rights organization, probing irregularities in community health funding. It took 3 days, and a push through the regional media liaison, but she got the preliminary statement. There they were, dozens of transfers labeled harmlessly: post-operative support, patient subsidy, rehabilitation allocation. But one name rose above the paper like a bruise on skin: Maynard Group Holdings, a construction company. The legal shell of Vince Maynard, Darnell's former employer, filed as a tax-exempt contributor to public health efforts. Those efforts, it turned out, led straight to this clinic, where voluntary donations from the poor became permanent disappearances, where a kidney wasn't just a life-saving gift, it was a transaction made in desperation. Even with the trail this clear, Crockett knew suspicion wasn't enough. Not with this system. She needed proof. Not just papers, but voices, motives, something irrefutable. And then she received an anonymous email. Subject line: "The people who need to hear this were never invited to the meeting." Attached was an unedited recording. 2 voices. One was deep, weighty, used to commanding rooms. Unmistakably Vince Maynard. The other, softer, more hesitant, was Franklin County's police chief. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough to shatter a whole tier of untouchable power. "You're not getting it," Maynard snapped. "Those wage theft claims, let 'em rot. Guys like Hayes, they're replaceable, always were. What matters is this: we can't let poor black folks think they can beat a business owner. If they believe they're entitled to something that isn't theirs, this whole system falls apart." The sender signed the email with one word: Rosa. Jasmine knew that name. Rosa Alvarez, Maynard's former secretary, forced into early retirement. A Latina woman in her 50s who had said nothing for years, and now without fanfare, had finally found her voice and offered it to justice. That morning, soft rain traced lines down the courthouse windows, fogging the view. Pale water pooled on the stone steps outside. Heavy, quiet, solemn. Inside, Darnell Hayes stood at the defendant's stand. His prison-issued jumpsuit fit too well, like it had been sewn with him in mind. He was one of many, ordinary men pulled into extraordinary injustice by a system that preached equality but practiced convenience. He was facing 17 charges: solicitation, conspiracy, participation in an unlicensed organ trafficking ring. The prosecution brought in a young assistant DA, quick, polished, ambitious. Rumor had it she once clerked for a state senator. She looked like the kind of person the state trusted to prove Darnell Hayes wasn't an exception, but an example. No public defender had taken the case. Some cited scheduling conflicts. Others didn't bother with excuses. And then Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom. She didn't begin with outrage, didn't beg for sympathy, didn't cry injustice. She just started telling the truth, one piece at a time: the ignored complaint, the police apathy, the public defender's fee of $250 for a man who didn't have $20. The clinic, funded by the same company that stole his wages. Each fact fell like a quiet blade, clean, precise, until what remained was a map of negligence wrapped in legal language. Then she queued up a video, just over a minute long. It played without narration, no dramatic score, just a hallway, a hospital, and two men. Marquis walked slowly, spine hunched, post-surgery frail. Darnell walked beside him, not touching, not leading, just close enough to catch him if he swayed. When Marquis stumbled near the end of the hallway, Darnell placed a hand on his shoulder. No words, just a bottle of water, a small packet of meds, and the stillness of someone who knew he had failed and still stayed. The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor looked down at her notes, shuffled pages, avoiding the screen. Crockett said nothing grand to close, just one sentence. So quiet the court reporter had to lean in to hear it. A criminal doesn't cry for someone else if he was truly a monster. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't fierce, but it shook something. Because in that moment, the law was no longer measuring a crime, it was measuring compassion. And from then on, this wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning for a system that had to answer the question no one dared ask. What did we do when a father had to sell his own body just to keep his children warm? That day in court, people didn't sit with their backs straight anymore. Some folded their arms, some looked down, some pretended to scribble notes just to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. The atmosphere wasn't angry. It was awkward, like someone had flicked on a light in a room where everyone had grown comfortable in the dark. Jasmine Crockett stood up. No gavel, no formalities. She took one quiet step forward and looked directly at the jury, not with accusation, but with something deeper. A gaze that asked them a question they likely hadn't asked themselves. If the law only protects those who can afford attorneys, if the poor must sell their own bodies to feed their children, if a man knocks on 11 doors and all 11 treat him like a burden, then where does the blame really lie? Silence fell, heavy like guilt with no name yet. She continued, still soft, still firm. Some of you may believe you're being impartial, but impartiality is not indifference. True fairness means looking beyond the act and into the circumstance. It means asking, did this person really want to do wrong, or were they just out of choices? A man in the jury, mid-40s, gray suit, close-cropped hair, shifted in his seat. His hands trembled as he rose. Everyone turned. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried because the air had no room left for noise. I request to recuse myself from this jury. I'm related to Sheriff Franklin. I should have said something from the start. I thought it wouldn't matter. Breath held. He went on, voice quieter now. I looked away when I saw who was behind the arrest. I assumed this would be a simple case, but I can't sit here and keep pretending I'm an impartial man. No one spoke. The judge didn't scold him, didn't challenge him. She simply nodded, the kind of nod that says, some trials aren't measured by verdicts, but by who had the courage to stand up. Crockett turned back to the bench, her voice steel beneath silk. Your Honor, we request an independent investigation into possible collusion and bias during the handling of this case, and I hope, this time, the truth doesn't get filed into another bottom drawer. Somewhere in the back, a quiet rustle, someone wiping away tears with their sleeve. A middle-aged woman, not related to the defendant, not connected to Marquis, just a local resident who had always believed the law would take care of everything. Now she saw it for what it was. The law is a tool, but justice only happens when someone has the courage to use that tool to touch another's pain. Crockett stepped back. No smile, no self-congratulation. She hadn't come to win. She came to hold up a mirror. At the next session, everyone looked more tired, not from lack of sleep, but because something inside them had cracked. The belief that the system, though flawed, was still fair, had begun to unravel. Judge Doolin, silver hair, robe iron stiff, resumed court. Darnell was let in. His eyes were still humble, but his shoulders were no longer bent. He knew, today something might be said that he never dared to imagine. Crockett stepped forward. No thick binder, just a single sheet of paper. pale blue with one simple header and a small attachment. Your Honor, I'd like to present newly surfaced evidence. We received an anonymous email from a source within Maynard Group Holdings. Attached was what appears to be a financial distribution chart detailing funding to 14 private clinics over the past 2 years. She paused just long enough for the room to look up. The total, nearly $1.9 million, each entry labeled with legal-sounding descriptions, facility upgrades, consultant fees, community medical grants. But every clinic on the list has one thing in common: at least one transplant procedure with no verifiable donor source. No one breathed, no one shifted. Only the prosecutor shuffled papers, fast, clumsy, as if trying to read faster than their conscience. Then Crockett placed a second sheet on the podium. No ambiguity, no softened edges. The email was sent from an address ending in @maynardgroup.org. But the specific sender? It was a personal account belonging to Cecilia Doolin, the wife of the presiding judge. The courtroom turned to stone. Judge Doolin froze. A translator coughed into her sleeve. The stenographer looked up. For the first time all day, Crockett didn't tremble, didn't gloat. She spoke gently, almost kindly. We're not making allegations, but under federal trial procedures, when there's evidence of personal financial entanglement, especially involving internal communications, the case must be escalated for impartial review. Judge Doolin set his gavel down, didn't bang it, just breathed and nodded once, then said the only words that mattered: "This court is adjourned. The case will be transferred to federal court for full investigation." The gallery buzzed, not loudly, not with outrage, just whispers. So they all knew. This goes deeper than we thought. A few hours later, the jail issued a notice. Darnell Hayes was granted conditional release. The charges stood, for now, but the federal court ordered a full review of all files and a reconsideration of whether Hayes had been a whistleblower, not a ringleader. Angela was waiting outside. No running, no tears, just an embrace, firm enough to remind a man who thought he'd lost everything that he hadn't been left behind. Markey was transferred to another hospital. A long-term recovery grant, usually reserved for victims of medical negligence, approved him as a special exception. That afternoon, for the first time in months, he picked up a basketball. He didn't shoot. He just stood beneath the hoop, spinning it slowly in his palms, and looked up at the rim, like he was calculating, can I still jump after everything I've lost? Some victories don't come with applause. Sometimes all it takes is someone left standing to tell the story of how, in the end, justice turned back around. There was no press conference, no red ribbon, no scrolling banner at the bottom of the screen declaring, "Justice has been served." Vince Maynard was arrested quietly on a Monday morning at home, handcuffed at 7:03 a.m., the same moment the morning news ran a headline about a state judge ordering a full investigation into Maynard Group's medical donations. Reporters were blocked at the gates of his gated community. None made it inside, but a single photo, Vince, head bowed, hand shielding his face, still burned its way across the internet like dry brush catching fire. 3 days later, Sheriff Franklin resigned. His letter, just 12 words: "I acknowledge critical failures in how this case was handled." No one needed more, because for the first time, someone who stood at the top of law enforcement bowed before someone the system had once deemed disposable. The Center for Regenerative and Community Health was shut down. A handwritten sign taped diagonally across the door read, "Closed due to administrative review." And just beneath it, scribbled in Sharpie, "Try closing for moral reasons next time." Darnell Hayes didn't go back to factory work. No one wanted to hire a man whose name had once been linked to organ trafficking, even if the courts hadn't ruled. He didn't complain. He asked to mop floors at a local middle school instead. On his first day, after wiping down desks and stacking chairs, he found a small piece of paper folded on one of the tables. No name, no handwriting he recognized. Just a note. "I know who you are. I watched the trial. I don't think you're bad. You remind me of my dad. Hope you have a good day." Darnell held that note like it was breath, like something long lost had been placed back in his chest. Rosa Alvarez, the woman who had sent the recording, the one who broke her silence after years of keeping her head down. They didn't talk much, just sat on her porch, sipping warm corn tea in silence. After a while, Crockett murmured, as if to herself, "A spring doesn't snap from pressure. It snaps when people stop believing it can bounce back." Rosa smiled, not at the words, but because she knew this time the spring had bounced, and the system, thick and brittle as concrete, had cracked, just enough to let the light through. A month later, a short column ran in a local paper. Old landfill in South New Haven being converted into a community garden. First registrant, a young man named Marquis. Second, his friend. Darnell and Marquis weren't doing anything grand, just planting lettuce, kale, tomatoes. One afternoon under soft sun, the two of them were pulling weeds when Marquis asked, not looking up, "You think you'll get cleared?" Darnell didn't hesitate. "I don't know, but I'm not scared anymore." Because some kinds of justice don't arrive with applause. They grow slowly, from calloused hands, from sweat no longer shamed, from one green sprout rising through old trash, and from someone bold enough to plant hope right in the rubble where it once died. That evening, as the last light stretched across the porch like a pale ribbon in a modest home on the south side of New Haven, where Darnell had once folded court papers and quietly wiped tears from his daughter's cheek, Angela sat alone at the kitchen table. The clock still ticked. The tiny cactus still sat in its pot. Only one thing was new, a letter folded in thirds lying open in front of her, written in blue ink, carefully, word by word. Sleepless night by sleepless night. She hadn't written it to accuse, not to thank, not to beg for sympathy. She wrote it because she believed, if someone has been silenced long enough, they deserve the chance to speak fully. If justice once stayed silent because people thought we weren't worth hearing, then today I will say it. We have a voice. And thanks to Mrs. Crockett, the dream of fairness no longer feels out of reach. The story ends. But something without a name or shape has been planted in the hearts of those who listened. Maybe it's empathy. Maybe it's a tear not yet shed. Or maybe just a moment of stillness after the radio goes silent. And if you're still sitting there, alone in your quiet room, then maybe you already understand. Justice doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts with small things, with listening, with believing that even those who have broken still deserve to rise.